The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $299 on a cold November Saturday in 2006 at the Newton County Equipment Auction outside Jasper, Arkansas, and a state patrolman in a starched gray uniform standing under the auction tent let out a hard, short laugh through his front teeth that turned the heads of the Ozark men in the bleachers. Trooper Alistair McCorkle was 45 years old, 6'2", broad-shouldered and slim-waisted, from 20 years on the highway, brush-cut sandy gray hair, a thick sandy gray mustache trimmed in regulation military style, sharp pale blue eyes hidden behind silver-mirrored aviator sunglasses, a deep year-round tan from the back of his cruiser. He wore the full khaki gray Arkansas State Police uniform of the early 2000s, a starched gray shirt with the Arkansas State Police shoulder patch and gold trooper badge over his heart, a black leather Sam Brown belt and shoulder strap, a holstered .357 Magnum on his right hip, a heavy black flashlight on his left, a wide-brimmed gray Stetson open-road trooper hat pulled low across his eyes, and polished black leather knee-high motorcycle boots. He had stopped at the auction on his way back to the Russellville barracks because his cousin had sold a 1976 Ford F250 and wanted to celebrate. The 1957 Autocar AP15 heavy-haul tractor with the hand-built single-boom wrecker rig in the back of the lot had been the joke of the morning, the last lot, and the trooper had told anyone within earshot that the truck was a rolling tetanus shot and worth less than its scrap weight. The 24-year-old salvage mechanic in a faded denim coat had just outbid him for $299 against the trooper's casual $60 opening shot, and the trooper was making sure the Ozark men understood the joke. Silas Pruitt folded his auction slip into the chest pocket of his coat and walked through the gravel to the truck. The Autocar AP15 was 19 feet of heavy-duty, conventional cab Pittsburgh steel, the cab painted a faded Bethlehem cream, oxidized to a chalky old bone yellow along the body panels, and rust brown along the lower edges. The chrome Autocar script badge across the radiator grille tarnished to a dull pewter. The chrome side cab swan neck mirrors snapped off at the brackets. A hand-built single-mast wrecker boom with a homemade pulley head and a hand-cranked single-drum winch welded onto the back of the tractor frame, listing slightly to the right with a frayed cable. The wooden fifth-wheel boards rotted, and the word junk spray-painted in flaking red block letters across the driver's door. Silas had grown up 2 miles down the Buffalo River from this truck. His grandfather, Tobias Pruitt, was waiting at the trailer. Toby was 75 years old, a retired sawmill foreman from the Weyerhaeuser plant outside Marshall, 5'8", short and barrel-chested, with a thick stoop, snow-white hair clipped close under a brown leather aviator-style cap with sheepskin ear flaps tied up over the crown, a thick salt-and-pepper mustache, deep watery gray eyes nested in crow's feet, deeply tanned and weathered cheeks scarred by decades of cedar shavings. He wore a heavy brown canvas chore coat over a faded forest green wool flannel shirt buttoned to the throat. Dark gray heavy twill work pants held up with worn black leather suspenders, scuffed brown leather lace-up work boots, and a plain brown leather belt with a worn brass buckle. A small wrapped peppermint stick sat between his teeth instead of a cigarette. Toby set one liver-spotted hand on the rust-brown fender of the Autocar and stood there a long minute without speaking. He said, "Son, you bought Cassius Drigger's old AP15. Cassius Driggers had run Driggers Heavy Haul out of a tin-roofed shop on Highway 7 in Jasper for 15 years, moving cut hardwood out of the Ozark hollows up to the Weyerhaeuser plant outside Marshall, dragging combines and stuck logging trucks out of the steep washouts after every spring thunderstorm. Cassius had built the single-mast wrecker boom onto the back of the AP15 himself in 1976, with a brand-new arc welder he had bought used from a hardware store in Harrison. He had married a Newton County girl named Loretta Bowen in 1968, and they had a son, Caleb, born in 1970. Cassius had died in September of 1988, when a new Holland round baler he was clearing in a neighbor's hayfield broke its drive shaft and a knotted chain whipped back across his chest. He was 53. Caleb was 18 and had just left for the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. The Autocar had been parked behind the tin-roofed shop with the radiator drained and the doors padlocked, and Loretta had paid the property tax on the lot for 18 years until she remarried in 2004 and moved to Hot Springs. Caleb had not come back to Jasper after he graduated. The auction had been the bank's idea. Silas had been in the back of the tent because his grandfather had heard the truck would be sold. They winched the AP15 onto Silas's borrowed gooseneck trailer that afternoon. Trooper McCorkle stood by his marked cruiser on the edge of the auction yard and watched, one thumb hooked into his Sam Brown belt, and as Silas pulled out, he called across the gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, the state of Arkansas would haul the scrap to the crusher in Russellville for free. Silas did not answer. Toby climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they pulled out of the yard and turned south on Highway 7 toward the small ridgetop farm Tobe had lived on for 43 years, the dead Autocar rocking behind them on the leaf springs, the home-built single-mast wrecker boom pointing at the gray Ozark sky like a bent finger. The restoration would take 18 years. Nobody knew that on the drive home. Silas worked his day job at a small machine shop in Harrison during the week, and he drove the 20 minutes up the ridge to Tobe's pole barn every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the engine. The original 707 cubic-inch Cummins NHE inline-six diesel had not turned over in 18 years, and they pulled it out of the truck with a chain hoist and disassembled it on a stand in the barn. The bearings were corroded, but salvageable. The crank was true. The head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 8-speed Spicer manual, and they pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first winter went into the engine and into stories about Cassius Driggers. Toby told Silas about the night in 1981 when Cassius had pulled an overturned chicken truck out of a flooded creek bed on Highway 74 with the AP15 and refused payment, except for a sack of country ham. He told Silas about the morning in 1985 when Cassius had hauled a snapped Cat D 8-dozer out of a sinkhole on the edge of the Buffalo National River and let the contractor pay him in oak firewood for the winter. He told stories about Loretta Driggers' biscuits. The second year, Tobe slowed. He had cataract surgery on both eyes in the spring and was 3 months recovering. The work paused. The third year, the cab came off the frame, and they cut out the rotted floor pans and welded in new ones from 20-gauge sheet. The fifth year, they sandblasted the frame in sections, and Tobe had a quiet heart attack in September that put him in the Harrison Hospital for 9 days. He came home thinner and slower, but his hands still worked. He told Silas the truck would wait. By the 8th year, the AP15 was a roller. By the 11th year, Silas's son was born, and the work paused for 2 months for the new sleep schedule. In the 14th year, Toby sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding wooden chair beside the wood stove now. The brown leather aviator cap pulled low, the peppermint stick replaced now by a sugar-free lozenge, and he pointed at what to do next. Trooper McCorkle had been promoted to lieutenant by the 8th year and to captain of Troop H by the 12th, and his marked black and gray cruiser drove past the foot of Tobe's gravel drive on Highway 7, sometimes on his way to a fatal on the highway, and the cruiser never quite slowed, but never quite passed at full speed either. By the 16th year, the Autocar was painted. They had wet sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy Bethlehem cream that matched a faded snapshot Toby had of the truck from 1978. And they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking red junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Silas did not know why. He just left it. By the 17th year, the single-mast boom was rebuilt with a fresh aircraft-grade steel cable and a polished brass-tipped pulley head and freshly painted flat black. By the 18th year, the Autocar was nearly whole. They had not yet touched the doors. The doors were the last thing on the list because Toby always said, "You start with what makes the truck move, and you finish with what makes the truck close." On a cold, clear morning of November the 17th of the 18th year, Silas pulled into Tobe's pole barn with a roll of new tan vinyl door panel material and a fresh set of stainless steel hinge bolts. He was 42 years old. The dark blonde at his temples had gone steady silver. The small scar across his left thumb from a piece of sheet steel in 2012 had faded to a thin white line. His hands had the heavy thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Toby was 93. He sat on his folding wooden chair by the wood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees, the brown leather aviator cap pulled low over his ears with the sheepskin ear flaps now tied down against the cold, the sugar-free lozenge tucked into his cheek, and he watched as Silas unbolted the driver's side door from the cab. He set the door on 2 sawhorses in the middle of the bay. He unbolted the upper hinge plate from the steel hinge post on the cab pillar. He set the hinge plate on the bench. He started to wire brush the inside surface of the hinge post on the cab pillar, and he stopped. There was something inside the hollow A-pillar behind the hinge plate. He could feel it with his fingers through the bolt holes. He set down the wire brush. He took a small magnet on a flexible wand from the bench drawer and probed inside the hollow A-pillar through the upper bolt hole. The magnet stuck to something flat and metal about 4 inches deep inside the pillar cavity. He pulled the magnet back out slowly. Attached to the magnet by the corner came a small flat steel tobacco tin box. The lid wire-tied shut. The tin painted faded green with the word JESTER, barely legible across the lid in chipped black script. He held the tin in his hand. It was lighter than expected. Inside, when he cut the wire and lifted the lid on the workbench, were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded 20s wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 36 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper totaling $720. There was a single United States Army Korea-era dog tag stamped with the name Otis J. Driggers, his service number T440 Plus Methodist. The chain corroded, but the steel still legible. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff card showing a young man in his mid-20s holding a swaddled newborn in front of a tin-roof shop. The date, August 1970, written on the back in pencil, and there was a folded single sheet of plain, yellowed lined paper. The creases brittle, the ink faded but legible. Silas unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated August the 12th of 1988. It read, "Caleb, the cash is for whatever a man needs cash for at 18. The tag is your grandfather Otis's. He carried it through Pork Chop Hill in '53. He gave it to me when I turned 18 and told me to hand it to my son when I trusted him to come home. The photograph is of you the morning your mother brought you home from the hospital. I am hiding these inside the hinge post of the autocar, because if anything happens to me on the road or in a hayfield, I do not want them lost. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Cassius Otis Driggers, Jasper, Arkansas, August 12, 1988. Silas sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Toby held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. Toby said quietly, "Cassius wrote this 30 days before the chain whipped back on him in that hay field. The boy never knew." They drove south to Fayetteville the next Saturday. Toby had called a man he knew from the lumber co-op who had a son who taught at the university, and the man had found Caleb Driggers in the engineering faculty directory. They drove down US 71 under a clear blue Arkansas morning and pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story craftsman bungalow on a tree-lined street near the campus. The man who came to the door was 54 years old. He had Cassius Driggers' heavy shoulders and his father's deep-set blue eyes. He wore a Navy University cardigan over a chambray button-down, dark khaki trousers, brown leather penny loafers. His name on the mailbox read, Caleb O. Driggers, Ph.D., Civil Engineering. Toby spoke first. He said, "Son, I knew your father. He worked on his AP15 in my barn in 1983. My grandson here bought the Autocar at the bank's auction up in Newton County 18 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something inside her that belongs to you." Caleb's face changed. He stood in the doorway for a long moment and then opened it wide and asked them quietly to come in. They sat in his living room on a worn brown leather sofa, and Silas set the 4 items down one at a time on a coffee table. The roll of cash first, then the dog tag, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Caleb picked up the dog tag. He turned it slowly between his fingers and read the name out loud. Otis J. Driggers. He said his grandfather Otis had come home from Korea in 1953 and had died of black lung at the Pratt Whitney coal yard outside Atkins in 1965 when Cassius was 30 and he himself was -5. He had never met the man. He had never seen the dog tag, and he had not known his father had one. He picked up the photograph and he looked at the boy he had been on the morning he came home from the hospital, and he did not speak for a long time. He read the letter twice. He did not cry until the second reading. He folded the letter and set it on the table. He asked if he could see the truck. They drove him up to Jasper the next morning. Caleb stood in the open bay of Tobe's pole barn and walked slowly around the autocar 3 times. He ran a hand along the single-mast wrecker boom, and he stood at the driver's door where the flaking red junk paint was still masked off in blue tape. He turned to Silas, and he asked the price. Silas looked at his grandfather. Toby held the wooden chair arm and said, "Son, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to bolt the door back on. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone, and then we are going to drive her down to Highway 7 in Jasper and park her in front of where your father's tin-roofed shop used to be, and paint your family name on the door in clean white the way he had it in 1976. The boy paid $299 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and to you. They finished the Autocar through that winter. Caleb drove up from Fayetteville every other weekend and worked alongside them. On the morning of April the 14th of the 19th year, they rolled the Autocar out of the pole barn under a clear blue Arkansas spring sky, and they drove her in convoy down to the empty graveled lot on Highway 7 in Jasper, where Drigger's heavy haul had stood until 2004. They parked her facing the highway. Silas handed Caleb a small can of deep red paint and a 1-inch brush. Caleb climbed up on the running board, and he painted out the flaking red junk on the driver's door. He waited an hour. Then he opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in his father's careful slanted handwriting, he painted across the door in clean, clear letters, "Drigger's Heavy Haul, established 1973. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her." He stepped down. A black and gray Arkansas State Police captain's cruiser went by on Highway 7. Captain Alistair McCorkle was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Autocar parked at the empty corner with the cream-painted door and the clean white lettering catching the morning sun. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not laugh. He drove on. The Autocar sits on Highway 7 in Jasper today, and the sign on the door reads, "Drigger's Heavy Haul, established 1973. Caleb Driggers runs an annual May reunion at that corner for the loggers and the hardwood haulers his father had worked with in the Ozarks. The $720 sits in a small lockbox at his house. The dog tag of Otis J. Driggers sits beside it. The photograph of the morning his mother brought him home from the hospital is framed in his Fayetteville office. The letter is in a small fireproof safe under his desk. He reads it once a year on the 12th of August. If you ever see an old Autocar AP15 parked at an Ozark highway corner with the words "Drigger's Heavy Haul" painted in clean white, slow down, roll the window down, and listen. There is a story in that truck that a trooper in mirrored aviators tried to send to the crusher for free, and the truck was always for the boy. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.